In the Victorian era, a period of unprecedented industrial growth, scientific advancement, and social upheaval, also grappled with a rising tide of crime. This surge, coupled with evolving societal philosophies on punishment and rehabilitation, led to a dramatic transformation of prisons. No longer simply holding cells, these institutions became instruments of moral reform, albeit through methods we now consider deeply inhumane. This paper will explore the grim realities of life for criminals within Victorian prisons, examining the conditions, punishments, daily routines, and the profound psychological and physical impact on inmates. Architectural bastions of control. Victorian prisons were imposing structures designed to project an image of unwavering authority and instill fear in the hearts of potential transgressors. Built of brick and stone, these fortresses dominated the urban landscape, serving as a constant reminder of the consequences of lawlessness. The very architecture contributed to the psychological manipulation of prisoners. Long, echoing corridors, towering walls, and small barred windows created an atmosphere of isolation and confinement, emphasizing the prisoner's separation from the outside world. The separate system, a popular prison design philosophy, prioritized individual cells and minimal interaction between inmates. This system, intended to encourage introspection and remorse, often resulted in profound loneliness, mental instability, and even psychosis. The physical structure of the prison, therefore, was the first step in breaking down the individual and molding them into a compliant prisoner. A world of deprivation and disease. Life within the prison walls was defined by deprivation on nearly every level. Overcrowding was rampant, a direct consequence of rising crime rates, and the prevailing belief in incarceration as the primary form of punishment. Cells designed for a single occupant often housed multiple prisoners, leading to a severe lack of privacy and exacerbating already deplorable sanitary conditions. Disease thrived in these overcrowded and unhygienic environments. Typhus, cholera, dysentery, and tuberculosis ran rampant, spreading rapidly through the close quarters and weakened immune systems of the inmates. The diet was intentionally sparse, designed to provide just enough sustenance to keep inmates alive, but far from sufficient for maintaining health and strength. Gruel, a thin porridge made from oats and water, was a staple food, supplemented by meager portions of bread and occasionally some meat. This monotonous and nutritionally deficient diet weakened prisoners' bodies, making them even more vulnerable to disease and further undermining their physical and mental resilience. Hygiene was utterly appalling. Access to washing facilities was limited, and vermin infestations were a constant plague. The lack of basic sanitation further contributed to the spread of disease and created an environment of perpetual discomfort, shame, and degradation. The very act of existing within these conditions was a form of punishment in itself. The theater of futile labor. Hard labor was a cornerstone of the Victorian prison system. It was believed that physical exertion, combined with enforced silence and isolation, would lead to moral reform and instill discipline. However, much of the labor was not only physically demanding, but also utterly pointless and soul-destroying. The infamous treadwheel, a large cylinder prisoners were forced to climb continuously, became a potent symbol of the futility and absurdity of prison life. Other tasks, such as picking oakum, unraveling old ropes, breaking rocks into smaller pieces, or operating hand-cranked mills, were equally monotonous and unproductive. The purpose of this labor was not to contribute to any tangible output, but to break the prisoners' spirits, instill obedience, and reinforce the sense of their utter worthlessness. Punishments and the reign of fear. Discipline within Victorian prisons was harsh, arbitrary, and often brutal. Corporal punishment, primarily flogging with the cat-o'-nine-tails, was a frequent occurrence, even for relatively minor infractions. The lash could inflict excruciating pain and cause lasting physical damage. Solitary confinement, often in dark, damp, and unventilated cells, was another common punishment, used to isolate and psychologically break down inmates. Even minor transgressions, such as speaking during work, failing to complete a task, or showing any sign of defiance, could result in a reduced diet, the loss of already limited privileges, such as access to books or writing materials, or even an increase in the severity of their assigned labor. The constant threat of punishment created an atmosphere of fear and anxiety, further contributing to the prisoner's psychological distress. The monotony of daily life. A typical day in a Victorian prison began before dawn with the jarring clang of a bell. Prisoners were roused from their cramped and often damp cells, often shared with multiple other inmates, and marched in silence to their designated work areas. The work itself was grueling and monotonous, lasting for hours with minimal breaks and under constant supervision. Silence was strictly enforced, and any attempt to communicate with fellow inmates, even a whispered word, could result in swift and harsh punishment. Meals were taken in silence, often in large cavernous halls under the watchful eyes of prison guards. After the day's labor was completed, prisoners were marched back to their cells, where they would spend the long hours of the night in isolation and darkness, often with nothing but their thoughts and the sounds of the prison to keep them company. The crushing of the human spirit. The cumulative effect of the harsh conditions, the backbreaking labor, and the constant isolation exacted a devastating toll on the mental and emotional well-being of the prisoners. The lack of human interaction, the relentless monotony of the daily routine, and the ever-present threat of punishment led to widespread depression, anxiety, and even mental breakdowns. The system was deliberately designed to break the human spirit, instill a sense of hopelessness, and strip away any sense of individual identity or worth. This made it incredibly difficult for inmates to reintegrate into society upon their release, often leading to a cycle of recidivism, a slow and arduous path to reform. While the Victorian prison system was initially championed as a means of moral reform and social control, it eventually came under increasing scrutiny from social reformers and humanitarian groups. Critics argued that the harsh conditions and purely punitive approach were counterproductive and did little to actually rehabilitate criminals. They advocated for a more humane system that focused on education, rehabilitation, and the development of useful skills that would enable prisoners to lead productive lives upon their release. However, change was slow and often met with resistance from those who clung to the belief in the deterrent power of punishment and the idea that criminals were inherently evil and beyond redemption. A legacy of suffering. The Victorian prison system, with its emphasis on punishment, isolation, and the crushing of the human spirit, left a long and dark legacy of suffering and broken lives. While some reforms were eventually implemented, the fundamental flaws of the system remained for many years. The experience of imprisonment in the Victorian era was often a brutalizing one, leaving inmates scarred both physically and psychologically. The high rates of recidivism suggest that the system largely failed to achieve its stated goals of rehabilitation and reform. Instead, it often created hardened criminals, ill-equipped to navigate the challenges of life outside the prison walls. The Victorian prison system serves as a stark and sobering reminder of the dark side of social reform and the enduring challenges of finding effective and humane ways to address crime and punishment. It stands as a testament to the enduring human capacity for both cruelty and the struggle for justice and compassion.